Hello, and welcome to episode 105 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We are here today with Governor Parris Glendening, who was a governor of Maryland from 1995 until 2003, currently the president of Smart Growth America's Leadership Institute, having spent 27 years as a political science professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, also the former county executive of Prince George's County, Maryland, and a Prince George's County council member. Governor Glendening, how are you doing today?
Just absolutely great, thank you.
Excellent. The first question I'd like to ask you is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
Well, I've been very fortunate actually in having three different careers that all in some way involve the public interest. I came to Maryland originally after I got my doctorate to teach, and I loved teaching at the university. It was really exciting, and it was very rewarding. And to this day, I still walk down the street in some communities and people will come up to me and say, "Oh, Professor Glendening." I know right away. I'll say, "Were you in my class?"
Yeah.
Because of that. But it was rewarding, and to see all these young people, many now retired and doing well on their own, having taken the class and enjoyed it. So that was a rewarding aspect of public service. And I think sometimes teachers, including university faculty, don't get the same general recognition as a public servant, but indeed they are. And then the second level, of course, was the elected office. I was fortunate, 31 years in elected office, 19 elections counting primary and general, never lost one. But I say that more because I had a feeling that we were doing really good things. I mean, in Prince George's County, for example, which is a overwhelming minority community, I got elected countywide 5 times.
So for our listeners who don't know, what is your racial demographic?
For Prince George's County?
No, you.
Oh, I am Caucasian.
And what is Prince George's County's
Prince George's County now is about 80% minority, mostly African American, besides Hispanic and Asian population. And back then when I was running for office, it was about 55-60% minority.
Was it unusual that minorities would elect a white governor? Or a county executive?
Well, the assumption was kind of across the country that people voted race. But indeed, this wasn't the case. I mean, I had African-American opponents, very good people, and still won overwhelmingly on each of them. And I say this more of a sense of personal fulfillment, that if you're out there on the right issues and you're really pushing things that are important, people look past issues of race. I mean, it is of no great importance to them. And the fact that I stressed the issues of education, and not just stressed, but worked successfully in many of them on education and on inclusion. And just as a quick example, when I came in as county executive, in a county that diverse, there were no minorities, no African Americans in the command staff of the Prince George's County Police. And I just looked at it and said, this is not going to work, guys. We got to change it. And it took some political effort to do so, but it was worthwhile. It was truly worthwhile. So it was those kind of things. And I really enjoyed being in public office.
So just before we go into how you enjoyed being in public office, you obviously, and just finishing up on this topic of race, you were representing a community that was significantly not the same race as you, and yet you felt diversity was so important that when you became county executive, you changed up the police force so that it was more representative of the population. So you were saying that when they elected you, to some extent, it wasn't that important. They could look beyond race. But then when you got there, you still felt that race was important to some extent, which is why you increased diversity in the police force. How do you explain that juxtaposition? Why was race still important?
It was important then, and it is important right now. We have to be very much aware of the necessity of having a sense of fairness, of addressing these great issues of inequity, many times centered around race, but not always. And also of inclusion. And if we want to have a really successful, prosperous, shared economy, large urban county like that, we have to be overt in our decision making to say to people, you are part of this government, you are part of this community, we are all in this together. And if you look at any department or any administration and you see no one that is like you at all, it's hard to relate quite as much. And so it was more something that grew out of that. But all of these things, I mean, like when I went on to be governor, it wasn't just being governor. It was truly rewarding. It was also interesting because I was the first governor since 1876, I believe it was, but from this side of the state. And everyone said, well, no one ever wins from Prince George's or Montgomery County or whatever. And we went on to even in the Newt Gingrich year, it was a tight election,
right.
but we won.
And for our listeners who don't know, Newt Gingrich was a Republican who introduced a contract with America that led to the Republican takeover of the Congress in 1994.
Exactly. And then 4 years later, we went on to an overwhelming re-election. But when I look back, what I see is the things we were able to do. I mean, we started, for example, the first smart growth, which I presume we'll be talking about later, environmental program, which became a model for the entire nation. And in fact, I'm invited to go speak around the world about exactly that. We started that right in the little old state of Maryland.
How'd you get that idea?
Well, when I first ran for office, one of the things that I promised to do was make a major effort to clean up our waterways, and particularly the Chesapeake Bay. But it became very clear to me that to be successful in cleaning up the bay really depended on what happened on the land. And up until that time, a lot of the focus was just on what we call point source pollution, meaning pollution coming out of sewage treatment plants or factories or whatever. But in fact, it is the land development policies, the clearing of the forest, the clear cut that goes right up to all the creeks and things like this, the silting that goes in, that matters. And so my perspective was, if we didn't address the issue on the land, we would never be successful in the water.
So non-point source pollution actually was a major contributor to pollution of the Chesapeake Bay, and prior to your administration, the focus had been on only addressing a portion of pollution sources, which was point source pollution.
That was the major. There was some focus on the rest, but that was the major. Former Governor Harry Hughes, and in many ways I stood on his shoulders.
A previous guest of Public Interest Podcast.
Oh, great. So you're probably aware, he put something in place called the Critical Area Commission, in which they put certain acreage immediately next to the shoreline of either tidal rivers or of the bay, in which for the first 100 feet you couldn't do any construction, and for the first 1,000 feet there were serious limitations on what you could do. Ironically, as a Prince George's County executive, I was appointed to represent the counties on the commission when that law was enacted, so I got to really know it well and to see its impact and to see that you could do things. And so we came in and put that in place, but there were other things. We put a very strong anti-gun violence bill through.
Before we move on to the anti-gun violence, just talking on smart growth, your smart growth policy, as you mentioned, has become very popular. It has subsequently been adopted in many states around the nation. You've been invited around the world to speak about it. In fact, one might even say it's one of your greatest legacies. You were honored by Governing Magazine primarily because of your smart growth legacy. Yet if you look at your lieutenant governor at the time, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who attempted to succeed you as governor in her campaign following your term-limited departure, you find that there was some agricultural backlash because of smart growth. There was these limits on development from Harry Hughes with the first 100 feet, first 1,000 feet. Can you talk a little bit about, you've had plenty of positive reception, but what have been the difficulties and who have been the opponents of smart growth? Because clearly there are some. It did lead to political ramifications.
I always tell people, very few people wake up in the morning and say, I want more sprawl, I want you to tear down the forest, I want more pollution and congestion and so on. But in fact, many groups do end up there for totally different reasons. The agricultural community, including when I was in office, resisted very much any of these programs. And they resisted it because it put severe restrictions on the development of their farmland. And the idea for many farmers was that if you had a farm, that eventually you could retire and automatically have developed. And that's why you see these scattered subdivisions.
That was their
all over the
retirement
country.
plan.
That was their retirement plan. And
So it wasn't that it was hampering their ability to raise chickens or raise soybeans. It was that it was hampering their ability to resell their land for other uses.
that was against the smart growth. Now, the other parts that we put in against runoff and requirements there was about the chickens and what they used and all. But there were other groups. I mean, a number of the developers were strongly opposed to this. A number of local elected leaders were opposed because they saw this as a state intrusion into land use and zoning and what they could do and so on.
So that was a political, territorial.
It was. And the large urban counties overwhelmingly supported this.
Because it wouldn't impact them adversely directly.
And they were trying, for the most part, to do things like this anyway. They were trying to get it together.
So how did agriculture respond? Is there still agriculture in Maryland?
Oh, yes. It's still a strong portion of the economy.
So this didn't wipe it out?
No, it didn't wipe it out. It's still doing very, very well. Unfortunately, it's been largely now taken over by big corporations. But the poultry and the pure agriculture and all is still very much there.
Did you find support from your Republican colleagues in trying to push forward smart growth legislation?
A number of them were helpful, both in the state and elsewhere. The thing that I found, for example, most interesting is later on I became chairman of the National Governors Association. And my chairman of the board, and when I was vice chair, he was chair, and I worked very closely, was Mike Leavitt, the former Republican governor of Utah. And he was a big proponent of many of the principles of smart growth.
Was that surprising to you?
It was, in the sense that you think of Utah as being a very, very conservative state. And it is, except that its conservative is much more a fiscal conservative and a conservative approach that actually says we have a responsibility to conserve our land. We have a responsibility to the planet Earth and all as well. And in fact, in my work here at Smart Growth America, we were just a couple of months ago out in Utah at the invitation of the new governor, new Republican governor, to help them with their transportation program to make it much more transit-friendly and walkable. And so as we go through all of these things, you know, the good news is, and it's something I wish we could get across more, is that you're not automatically good guy or bad guy just because you're a Republican or a Democrat. There are some Democrats who quite candidly oppose my program and oppose...
Chris Van Hollen was a leader in the opposition in your attempts to get the state to pay for stadiums in Maryland. He was a leading Democrat in the Senate.
He was, and Chris is a good friend of mine, and we work together. We are, as we say, poker buddies.
Yeah.
We poker together and stuff like that. But he was very much opposed to the stadium. Interestingly, when I ran for office, the last thing I had in my mind was going to build a football stadium, much less two.
Did that align with smart growth?
The one in Baltimore did. The one in Prince George's County did not. What is clear now is that a major sports facility located downtown, in which you minimize parking, you have transit access.
Which is where the Redskins were prior to coming to Maryland.
Which is where they were prior to that. And so we were advancing the stadium at the location down there. And if you look in downtown Baltimore, you see people come early, they go out to dinner, they'll stay over at the hotels, they'll take transit back and
Good
forth
for the
and
economy.
so on. Good for the economy, good for them, because it's not like in the Redskins Stadium where there's nothing to do around there. So the only thing they do is come and tailgate for 2 hours beforehand and probably drink a little bit too much and so on. And it does not add anything to the Prince George's County economy.
So if you were governor, if you were to redo it again, if you were to go back in time and say, oh, now I'm back in the 90s, I'm governor again, would you have redone the Raven Stadium as you had done it, but then choose to decline building the Redskins Stadium?
Well, this is where the reality of legislative politics comes in. When we approved the Raven Stadium and said, okay, let's do this, and it was paid for through the Stadium Authority by way of lottery sale tickets and all, but okay, let's do this. I got most of the votes together in the legislature that I needed to have this approved when we had a visit from the representative for the Redskins owner, Jack K. Cook, who said that they wanted to move out to Prince George's County. And I told them that I wasn't very enthusiastic about that at all, that I thought they belonged downtown, or at least in a real urbanized area, but preferably downtown. And a little bit later on, my legislative officer came to me and said that our votes were starting to slip away. And I said, well, what's happening?
Votes for what?
For the
Raven
Stadium. And the reason they were is, and I'm sympathetic to this, but I called, for example, Senator Ulysses Curry, who was chairman of the delegation at the time, and I said, Julie, I said, everyone's promised me to vote for this. What's going on? And he said, well, we have a hard time voting for a stadium in Baltimore if we can't vote for a stadium in our own county, especially now that this proposal is known. And I was sympathetic with it. Now, the same was true for some from Montgomery. Now some people, like Chris Van Hollen, opposed it because they just didn't think that's where a state could be, and I respect that position. But the votes, we started counting, and it was clear we would lose the vote for the Ravens if we did not include some aspect of the Redskins in there.
Couldn't you propose other pork?
When you're dealing with football politics, it's a different kind of animal altogether. Sports and politics often do not mix very well, but when they mix, they're almost irrational.
So we were talking about having Republican support for smart growth policies. Now, we have a photo in your office of former President Ronald Reagan. Do you have a story about how you had a relationship with him and your family?
I do. It's interesting because I have, if you look carefully, a photo of either me or my son or whatever with all of the presidents since Ronald Reagan. And what I found was, first of all, Ronald Reagan was a very decent person. I mean, I enjoyed working with him. I enjoyed talking to him.
Now, you are a Democrat. He was a Republican.
I am a Democrat. I'm a liberal Democrat and a very proud progressive. He obviously was a conservative president. I worded that way because he was liberal in his earlier careers, but conservative president. But when it came one-on-one and talking to him and working with him, and so my son Raymond, who at the time was only 6 or 7 years old, said, have I ever met President Reagan? And I said, yes, because you get to meet all the presidents when you're a county executive, because Andrews Air Force Base, which they use for Air Force One and taking off and everything, is in Prince George's County.
All right.
And so you work with them. And so I said, I have. And he said, well, can I meet him? And so I figured, proud dad, okay, let's try this. And the head of the Secret Service lived at the time in Prince George's County. We contacted him and they made arrangement. And the president took just a few moments. He was actually coming back from a trip to Tennessee. I remember this so clearly. And stopped and talked to Raymond, took some pictures with him. I still have these pictures of him standing next to the president. But if you look and you look at the other one, I worked very closely with Bill Clinton. He was just so into working in the personal relationships and so on. When we passed the anti-gun violence bill, which I was so proud of because I know it saved lives, he came out to Annapolis for the bill signing ceremony.
The President of the United States.
The President of the United States, and to give a speech about how important he thought this bill was and so on. And so I worked with him on several things. He was very helpful in my re-election and all as well. But there are the others there as well. If you see both George Bush Sr., George Herbert Walker, and then also W. Bush, I worked with them, as many people did. I disagreed with some of the policies. George Bush Sr., it wasn't even that much I disagreed with. He was just an easy guy to work with. But for George W. Bush, I disagreed, especially on the foreign policy. But when you talk to him one-on-one, we were governors together. He was governor of Texas while I was governor here. And then
were you head of the Governors Association while he was governor of Texas?
I don't remember that, to tell you the truth. I know we worked together, and I was active in the association. But in any case...
So you were able to respect them as individuals who were seeking to advance the public interest, just as you were. but they just merely had a different understanding of what constituted the public interest and how to get there.
Exactly so. And when you disagreed, it was never anything personal, and you normally worked around the edges of things and got things done.
Now, Ronald Reagan introduced comprehensive tax reform on the federal level in the 1980s. You worked to introduce tax reform in the state of Maryland in the 90s. Were there any similarities?
There were some. We did reduce some taxes, particularly.
You reduced the personal income tax.
Personal income tax, a minor amount. But we also increased some taxes to support things that were needed. We increased some taxes, particularly to support education and higher education.
Sure.
And so there was a balance on this. And I guess one of the biggest battles I had was a dramatic increase. We were one of the first states to do this on the tobacco tax. I am personally strongly opposed to smoking. My father, who smoked a couple packs a day, died at only 50 of a heart attack, and my mother, who smoked even more, died of lung cancer. But more importantly, you could see the impact on the population overall. And so what we decided to do is put a very dramatic increase on the cost. I wanted to raise it the first time, $1 a pack. The legislature objected, but they did permit me to raise it 37 cents a pack, and evidently, over the next several years, it went up to $1 a pack tax on it. Then what we did...
Did you see a diminishing in smoking incidence of new smokers with the increased tax?
Yes, a dramatic decrease, both here and across the country.
So it improved the public health and potentially was a financially sound move because it reduced the cost to the state of caring for the negative externalities of having smokers with negative health outcomes.
And that's one of the main reason we did was not the revenue, but the impact on health. But we took that new revenue and we funded a children's prescription program. Now, this was before the Affordable Care Act and everything else. Our health people told us that there were almost 90,000 children in the state of Maryland that did not have health coverage for basic prescriptions. And so the legislature objected to my putting the new tax in. And so what we did is we dedicated exclusively to children's prescriptions. I went around the state.
For Medicaid?
It was run through the Medicaid, but it was an individual, special state-only program.
And this preceded George W. Bush's Medicare Modernization Act that introduced Medicare Part D prescription drug coverage for
adults. It was before that. And the way I got that through, and sometimes politics can be fun too, is I went around the state and I held up a bottle of amoxicillin, and I referenced my son, and I said he used to get these terrible earaches, and when he did, we'd go to his pediatrician, and she would prescribe this, and within hours, he would start to feel better. In 2 days, his ear infection would be all gone. And I said the problem was, and I forget the exact amount, but it was something in the neighborhood like $150 for that little bottle of medicine. And I said the problem is, I have health insurance, and he was covered. I said, there are 90,000 children. When they get that earache and they can't afford this, either they end up going to an emergency room, which is ridiculous for them and for the cost effectiveness, or they simply suffer.
Right.
And I would tell them, I said, call your legislator and tell them to approve the tobacco tax, because this is how we're going to fund it. And it wasn't too long after that the legislative leadership, and particularly the Senate, contacted me and said, let's sit down and talk about it. So you're not going to get $1 a pack, but how much do you need for the children's health program? And it turned out to be 37 cents, and that's where that increase came from. We also, by the way, when there was the national settlement with the tobacco companies, we took our money and we devoted it not to general government, or not like North Carolina did. They subsidized tobacco growers who were going to lose there. But we put a significant portion of it into our cancer centers, particularly Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland. We also bought out the tobacco rights for the farmers, most of the tobacco farmers in southern Maryland. We actually offered them so much an acre per year for the next 20 years, put a lien on their property. They would continue agriculture and continue a variety of different sources there, but they could not grow tobacco. Almost all of the tobacco farmers bought into that, bought into it very quickly. It soon became such that the tobacco wholesale farm barns and all closed up.
So you were helping Maryland agriculture through this tobacco prevention subsidy at the same time that you're introducing smart growth that might have had a little bit of opposition from agriculture.
Right.
So same
I
on the one
worked in
hand.
Southern Maryland where tobacco was. Southern Maryland, it didn't work at the Eastern Shore because there was no tobacco over there.
So agriculture at the same time was potentially your ally and your adversary for
Exactly.
different issues.
Exactly, which is true for so many things. I mean, when I think of the
Well-
things that we were able to get through, you run into that constantly, and you put a balance of things and try to figure out what's best for the public, and then you move ahead.
You've spoken about being a legislator and still seeing many of your students today. Now, an educator. And of course, there are some educators who have entered politics. President Barack Obama was a constitutional law professor. Congressman Jamie Raskin was a constitutional law professor. President Woodrow Wilson was at Princeton University. You think of various educators who went, but one thing you think about is as a member of a university, you have a lot of data, a lot of information. And yet, as a politician, you have to sell these things, and you have to present personal anecdotes. For instance, a story of your son with the amoxicillin, as opposed to just saying, there's 90,000 people. It costs this much when we shift them over to the emergency department. This is the negative consequences of that. So how were you able to transition from being an academic and using your data to being able to really connect with voters and make real policy change?
I think the thing that was probably most helpful there is that I didn't try to start at the top. I was teaching politics, teaching state and local government, and there was a vacancy on the city council where I was living in the city of Hyattsville. And so I was fortunate, I knew the mayor and worked with him in a vacancy. I was appointed for the short run and then ran for election. And so I served my first couple of years in public office on the Hyattsville City Council. Right about the same time, the form of government was changed for the county, and they expanded the county council. I ran for one of the open seats, and I was 8 years on there. And so it was perhaps a skill that I learned more than just walking out of the classroom and saying, I'm going to run for governor or something of that type. And
Did you ever have trouble reconciling the data with the ability to sell good policy to the public?
Not really, although I think the general public, let me word it this way, likes to hear the story. They want to know what the story behind this is. How does it affect their life, and what does it mean? And telling that story becomes much more important than the data. You have to know what you're talking about in terms of how many lives you might save, how many children are uninsured, how much pollution is going into the bay, how much forest land we're losing every year because of development and so on. You have to know all that. But the average citizen struggling with the day-to-day of family and job and everything else is not really extraordinarily interested in that. But they are interested in, I love the bay, and you telling me this bay could be dead water in 20 years? And I would describe how I would go out fishing with friends and family and the excitement of catching it and all, and are we going to lose this for our children? Or you would go through other things about being county executive in Prince George's County, where at one time the homicide rate was really horrendous. In fact, during the so-called crack wars, we had a period where we had an average of a homicide a day. And you don't describe it as having 350, 360 homicides. You describe it as the agony that is caused to families when this happens. And that is why we had to do some things totally differently. And people understand that. It's just like right now there's a wave of criminal justice reform, both at the federal and the state and local level going on. And because for the first time, people were starting to tell the stories of what happens. If you're, for example, 18 years old and you get arrested for possession of marijuana, and this is your third arrest for some relatively minor thing like that, and you're sentenced to life in prison, or even 30 years in prison with parole eligible and 15 years. I mean, it makes no sense to ruin a life like that, and it makes no sense in terms of even the cost of government. So when you describe it,
the human
the
impact,
specific human impact, it makes a difference. I'll tell you, I went to the Women's March, the Great March, just this last Saturday, and I have a 14-year-old daughter, and she and two of her friends came with my wife and I, and to watch her in the midst of somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 people, and seeing the dynamics and seeing the action. And I told her how when I was a college student involved in a similar march in Tallahassee, Florida, to desegregate some of the businesses around there, impact it had on me all my life. And look, this is what you will remember. I could see, I mean, they were wide-eyed, they were looking at this, they were, those three girls and so many other young ladies who were there will, in addition to the issues, clearly have a better understanding of what mass collective action is all about. And so, I mean, that again was just another story that really does impact people.
So with all these stories, if I were to say, you know what, next year you're going to teach another class in political science all year round at University of Maryland College Park, as you once did when you first came to Maryland, with all of your years of experience in governance and elected office, would you teach that class any differently?
Oh, I'm sure I would. First of all, the world's changed. The whole world's changed. You know, it's like people who are trying to run elections based on what happened 5 elections ago, when the impact of social media and the differences on the way television and the radio works now and everything else, the change in campaign finance laws, all of that stuff. But the issues have changed. The way people respond to them have changed. People don't have the party identification that they used to have. The ability, unfortunately, to totally gerrymander districts and everything. So much has changed. But the other thing I think I would probably emphasize more is the power of individual and collective action to get real change. And so if you are an individual who is really concerned about a particular issue, and you're willing to dedicate some of your time and your energy to this, you can, in fact, make a difference. And if you recognize that the way you do that is by mobilizing collective action, then you can cause a dramatic difference. I mean, I thought the most recent real demonstration of this was just recently when Congress, just upon starting the new session, was going to repeal the ethics office. And in a matter of 24 hours, they totally reversed themselves. Now, a little bit was because the president said, I don't think you should be doing it. The president-elect said, I don't think you should be doing this either. But there was a massive mobilization, and every congressional office down there heard about it. And for most people, they don't know what the ethics office is, but they did know there was an instinct that said, this is wrong. You can't have Congress unregulated by ethics. And so that was just one more example of what collective action fully mobilized could do. And every collective action starts with one person standing up and saying, no, we're going to do this differently.
So as we near the end of this podcast, I'd like to ask you a final question, reflecting on you being that individual who stood up and said, you know what, we're going to do this a little bit differently, and ask you about your legacy. What does it mean that you were here, that you've contributed on the Hyattsville City Council, on the Prince George's County Council, as a county executive, as a governor, leader of smart growth around the world? I've asked you this question a few years ago, and surprisingly you mentioned that it was your daughter, your family, that you saw as your greatest legacy. Can you take a moment to speak to our listeners about what it means that Parris Glendening was here?
Well, I don't want to sound trite about this, but the basic answer is still exactly the same. I have been blessed. I have a son who is now 37 years old and doing extraordinarily well. Raymond, and every time we get together regularly, his office is only a few blocks from my office. Every time I listen to him, work with him, and he is involved, he's passionate about these issues, and I just think with pride, you know, this is my son. And then when I watch my daughter, who every parent is proud, but she really, really is sharp on science and math, and she's already mapped out what she wants to do. She wants to be a neurosurgeon, and she's a very, very competitive equestrian competitor and all. And I watched that, and I think, this, everything else aside, when I'm in the last few hours of my life, I am probably not going to sit there and think back about smart growth or about the Children's Health Program or anything like that. But I will be thinking, obviously, of my family and how fortunate I am. The other aspect of it is, though, these programs were not important just because of programs. They were important. My daughter and I were walking down the street. Her name's Bree, short for Gabrielle. We were walking down the street in Baltimore a number of years ago now. We had just gone to a production at the Arena Stage over there, the Arena Stadium, and a gentleman came up to me and said, he recognized me, he said, you saved my life. And my daughter's there looking at her, what's this all about? And he said he had a very serious drug problem. And I increased dramatically the drug treatment funding even back then. And he said, if I didn't have that, he said, I wouldn't be here right now. And I have run into other people who have had some type of positive impact coming out of this. And to me, that's what's really important. Now, it's great to be able to work as I do now to help save the planet, so to speak, in big terms, maybe save just the Anacostia River in more localized terms. It's great to be a real proponent of higher education and overall, but know that you've helped so many kids become productive citizens themselves. But what really matters, I think, is not so much the program itself, but the public policy impact. I am not prone that often to quoting Republican leaders, but I will tell you, George Herbert Walker Bush was absolutely right when he said public service is a noble endeavor. And it is. And not just for me, but for everyone that's out there. Most of the people in public service could be doing other things, certainly making more money, less stress, and so on, but they understand what has to be done. And that's the reason I think people go into public service, and that's the reason we can look at the options really of making a better world.
That has been Governor Parris Glendening, president of Smart Growth America's Leadership Institute, former county executive, Prince George's County, Maryland, member of the Montgomery County Council, former political science professor at University of Maryland College Park. Governor Glendening speaks about essentially the human impact of public service, that public service is noble and honorable, and that improving the lives of individuals is not only a way of hitting home on the implications of good policy to the voters and to other legislators, but really understanding that you're in public service to make a great impact in people's lives, and that his legacy, both in his children, he has a positive human impact on their lives and through them on all the lives that they touch. And then through policy and as an elected official, he has sought to, through his elective office and through his lifetime of public service, always sought to ground himself in the human implications of his instruction at the university, of his decisions as an elected official, as an international leader in smart growth policy. So, Governor Glendening, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed the opportunity.
And that has been episode 105 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. You can listen to Public Interest Podcast at publicinterestpodcast.com on iTunes and Apple on your podcast app. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.